You negotiated a contract of sale between the seller and the purchaser. The purchase price is 1.5 million rand. You get the purchaser to sign, and you take the contract to the seller to sign as well. The contract is perused by the seller, and thereafter he's happy with all the provisions, and he signs the agreement as well. Then the seller mentions, by the way, that the property has already been attached by the bank because he has not been able to pay his bond installments for the last couple of months. Question is such an agreement of sale valid, and can it indeed be executed? Now, such an agreement in principle, in my opinion, is indeed valid. In other words, the seller and the purchaser would be bound to the agreement. However, whether the seller would still be able to transfer the property in terms of the contract of sale would, in my opinion, depend on whether the bank is happy to allow such a sale. Now, in most cases, as long as the bank receives the full cancellation figure, in other words, the full amount still due by the seller to the bank in respect of the mortgage loan, the bank would indeed not have a problem and consent to such a sale. It, however, also depends on how far the transaction is and how far the execution steps of the bank have progressed. If, for example, the bank has merely a short while ago attached the property as such without taking any further execution steps after having obtained judgment, then they would quite readily, in my opinion and my experience, consent to the sale. However, if they, the bank, in other words, have progressed quite far with the execution process and, for example, already arranged a sale and execution, then it's more difficult in many cases to get the bank's permission. For example, if the sale and execution is to take place 5 days after the agreement of sale has been signed, then in my experience, the bank would normally also require the purchaser to be able to prove that he has the funds available to finance the transaction. In other words, he would either have to pay the purchase price and trust into the conveyancer's account, or have proof that he has already obtained a bank loan to finance the purchase price. Now, the reason for this is that the bank obviously doesn't want the parties to collude to delay the execution process, and specifically the sale and execution. So consequently, obviously, it's quite easy to just sign a contract of sale between the seller and the purchaser. So that would typically, if the bank is already that far with the execution process, not be good enough. They would also require the purchaser to be able to show that he is indeed, he has indeed got the bank loan or the cash available to finance the purchase price. What I should maybe also mention is that in some cases, the banks are also happy to negotiate a lower cancellation figure. If, for example, the bank also realizes that it might be difficult to get a good price at a sale and execution, they would, in some cases, be prepared to reduce the cancellation figure. I've had cases where the bank was prepared to reduce it with as much as 200,000 rand, which means that you can still proceed with the transfer process. However, the bank would typically then still require the seller to sign an acknowledgement of debt to cover the balance of the mortgage loan, which is then not paid from the process of the sale. So it's not a case of the seller getting a total write-off of that debt, but at least the sale can be proceeded with. At least you can get your estate agent, the seller can cover a large portion of the mortgage loan, and then he just needs to pay the balance of the loan in installments. So there are options to address such a shortfall on a cancellation figure, especially if the property market hasn't been that good. You often get a case where you cannot find a buyer to cover the mortgage loan, in other words, to cover the cancellation figures, and in such a case, that plan B should be put on the table, whereby an acknowledgement of debt is with the consent of the bank signed in respect of the shortfall. Also, keep in mind that when the bank has already attached the property and you apply for cancellation figures, that's now the conveyancing attorneys, the application has to be addressed to the legal department of the bank. And then typically, in my experience, that leads to a substantial delay in the transfer process. If the cancellation figures are applied for in the case where the seller is not in arrears, then typically the figures are readily available and there's no delay. However, once there has been attachment, in my opinion, in my experience, it takes considerably longer to obtain those cancellation figures and to finalize the transaction.